The Reserve Bank of New Zealand has opted to hold interest rates at the historic low of 2.5% for an 11th straight meeting. I'm Natalie MacDonald, and joining me on the phone now is Shamubeel Eaqub, Principal Economist at the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, to discuss this decision and future prospects for New Zealand's economy. Investors had suggested that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand may need to increase pressure on New Zealand through a rate cut, but the central bank has opted against this once again. Shamubeel, why is that?
The Reserve Bank has been pretty clear about keeping interest rates on hold for some time, and that reflects a pretty flat economy in New Zealand, and they're holding a little bit of interest rates as insurance should things worsen in Europe.
Inflation has fallen over 4% in the last 12 months. What weapons does the RBNZ have in its arsenal to combat this?
There's very little inflation in the economy right now. Last print was 1%, which is at the bottom of the Reserve Bank's 1 to 3% range. They could cut interest rates a little bit more. At 2.5% interest rates, still have a little bit of room to fall. The fact of the matter is, inflation pressures in the economy are, in core terms, about 2% and about the medium-term average. And they wouldn't be looking to reduce inflation or increase inflation much from here.
Whichever way the RBNZ moves, it is going to have an effect on currency performance. What are your forecasts for the Kiwi dollar?
We think the Kiwi is going to hang up at a relatively high level. The big risk for the New Zealand dollar is very much around what happens in Europe. Because it's a small and peripheral currency, if there is a big amount of movement in risk appetite, then we tend to see the New Zealand dollar move. So if we see some really bad news coming out of Europe, there is a risk that the New Zealand dollar will fall, and pretty sharply. But outside of that, we would expect the New Zealand dollar to hold up at a relatively high level.
You mentioned there Europe. How exposed is New Zealand's economy to the European debt crisis at present?
Europe has been important, so it has had an impact. About 15% of our exports go to Europe, and exports to Europe have come off. But we're also very dependent on Asia and Australia, whose economies haven't been as affected yet. So we are kind of waiting for the second round effect of that to come down. And we are seeing some weakness in Asian economies, in exports in particular, and we think that will have an impact for New Zealand. But there is an alternate angle in terms of how it affects New Zealand, and that's through financial markets. Because New Zealand is quite reliant on foreign capital, the fact that the European capital markets and capital markets in general are risk averse, this might be making it much more difficult for New Zealand banks to borrow, and that might raise the cost of borrowing and pull back the recovery that we're seeing in investment in New Zealand.
Do you feel, therefore, that there should be a greater focus on creating growth internally?
The domestic economy is pretty flat, but it is starting to recover from the recessionary lows. The pace of the recovery is modest. There's very little the Reserve Bank can do at this point in time to stimulate demand, mainly because households don't want to borrow money. And in the face of this borrowing strike, it's very difficult for the Reserve Bank to stimulate the economy. What we would like to see is some movement on interest rates to encourage the New Zealand dollar to come down, which might give us more of a boost on exports and a buffer against the slowdown in global demand.
Shamubeel, that's all we've got time for right now, but thank you for your time. You can check out other exclusive interviews just like this one on the Dukascopy TV website. For now, though, goodbye.